So I am Sichangu. That was me about 12 years ago. I had really long hair. My wife said, "What do you look like with long hair?" So we grew it out. And I am a registered member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. We are the only group of people in the United States that has to be documented. Why? It's the United States government. They wanted to know the number of Indians that were left. So if you go into the history books, you'll discover that from about the time of Andrew Jackson and beyond, almost all the way up until probably the 20s, one of the big things is, what do you do with the Indian problem? How do we keep getting their land? How do we get them off their land? And so the only way that they could legally do it was to wage war, and then the second way was to starve them and just eradicate them. And the only way that they could police how many there were was by having us be registered. And so we have to document. If you are not federally recognized as a member of your tribe, then you can't claim tribal status. I am. That's why we're going out in a week, to make sure that my son and daughter are registered. So, so growing up, because I lived here and not on the Rosebud, I didn't receive any aid or assistance. So everybody thinks that there's stuff that is given to people or whatnot. Because I didn't live on the res or within 30 miles of the res, I didn't receive any assistance and couldn't claim my American Indianness for going to college or any item like that. So Minnesota had different rules, but you had to be a Minnesota member. So South Dakota, yeah, So the Rosebud is where my family's from. Mission is to the east, and who's the famous guy from Mission? Price is Right. Yeah, he's from Mission. Yep. St. Francis is the head of the Jesuit location, and that's just to the south of Rosebud, and so there's a big Jesuit church there. Mission is also a location where there's some Jesuit stuff, and it's called Mission because that's where the missionary grouping was, and that's where they brought the kids to school. So the only school that technically is on that reservation was at Mission for a long time. Now there's a few others, yeah. So Rosebud is the center. It's all Sichangu. It's the burnt thigh. The argument is that everybody that's on the Rosebud is related to Sinte Gleshka. He is Spotted Tail. He's the person that said to the Sichangu, you're going to live here. He was in the 1868 conflict, and before the 1868 conflict, this is a really interesting tale. So there was an incident that occurred on the Platte River. 3 young boys, there was 12, 13, and I think it was 2 13-year-olds and a 12-year-old, or it was 2 13-year-olds and a 14-year-old. They were young. They were probably 7th graders, 8th graders. It would be in modern term. And they did what those type of boys did. There was a cow that was not attached to a wagon, but it was following the wagon train. They practiced their hunting skills, and they killed the cow. They brought it back to they were really super proud. They gutted it and cleaned it, and they started cooking it, and everybody started to eat it. The person that owned the cow saw it happen. When they got to which is just off the Platte, the fort. Now I'm drawing a blank on the name of the fort. But when they got to the fort, they told the cavalry officers there. So they went to where the community was, and they said, hey, these guys stole a cow, and they killed it. They need to be punished. And in Lakota culture, when someone is not of age, the adult will take the punishment so that the young person can see the consequences of what happens by their actions. So my great-great-great-grandfather, Spotted Tail, was one of those men that stepped forward and said, you'll take me. 2 other guys stood forward. They tried them, put them on a train, and sent them to St. Augustine, Florida, where they were incarcerated for 90 days. In that travel, my great-grandfather saw how many people were not Indian in America. And he advocated not fighting against the Americans after that because there was just too many of them. There's not enough of us. There's a famous story, there's more they're like blades of grass, where we're not. So it's an interesting tale, but the real great tale in that story is that they sacrificed their life, in a sense, for the younger kids so that they could see the ramifications of what they did. And it's a really interesting premise when you think about that. So the Rosebud is the home of the burnt thigh. This is overlooking what is called Horse Creek. And Horse Creek is just south of White River, South Dakota. And this is where my mom grew up. So there's a couple ranches down here. It's the Little White River. So it's these high bluffs and then these lowlands and lots of rolling hills that are all grass. It's springtime. I took this picture in the spring because there's green. It's normally this color all the time. But it's very pretty. You can see, I always remarked, why is Montana called the land of the big sky? Because you can see big sky when you're in western South Dakota. But so from the time I was able to ride a horse, my aunt and uncle, who were 6 and 8 years older than me, would put me on the horse, and that's how we spent our days, is riding horse in this valley. So I have great memories of this valley. So I spent a lot of time and riding horse, and just we used to swim in those. They'd block those off with a little like earthen dam, and then they'd fill up with water from the rain. And then catfish in them. Ooh. I saw a catfish in the back of my uncle's truck that was like that. So, what's that? Yeah, and then he would eat them. My mom would give him a hard time. So this is Sentegleshka. I already gave you, I got ahead of myself. His sister was married to someone that we refer to as Tashuanka Witko, or Crazy Horse. And he's a very famous Lakota. He is claimed by both Sichangu and Lakota because his mother was a Sichangu, his dad was an Ogallala. So there are claims to both sides of it. So if you have direct connection to Spotted Tail, then you have direct connection to Crazy Horse. So when he got home after the 1862 conflict and he put everybody on the Rosebud and said, we're not going to fight anymore, he cut off all of his kids' hair and put them in suits and sent them to the Carlisle Indian School. His theory was that the only way we would win is if we became American, and that we got educated and we did things the way they did, and that's the way. So that leads to another story. My mom, when she was in 8th grade, the whole city of White River and Horse Creek came together and had a big celebration. And the celebration was that they were sending my mom off to school, and that when she left, she wasn't allowed to return to live to the Rosebud because she was going to follow the doctrine that he had set, and that she was going to become our family's success. And so she was sent to a girls' school in Yankton, just west of Yankton in Springfield. And she had an English headmaster. She had a Lebanese cook and a Moroccan sous chef at this place. So I grew up eating foods that weren't Minnesotan. I stuffed grape leaves and what she called tiger meat or kibe, and all sorts of things. We had tea, and we would stop in the afternoon and have tea and have a snack. So there were all sorts of things. It was really cool. My mom's a really cool lady. So the doctrine was that the only way we're going to survive was that if we become. So that was given to my sister and I, that she was going to be college educated, and that we were going to be college educated, and that we weren't allowed to return there to be, that we had to succeed here. And so that's part of the doctrine. That's why I do what I do, and all because of this person. you imagine being in 8th grade and told that you can't return, that you're going to do this for your family? So I think it's just more history of Spotted Tail. If you read up on him, he's a very, very interesting and a very prolific warrior. Now the hard part is that he was killed by another Crow Dog, and Crow Dog didn't want to become. He wanted to stay Lakota, and so him and Spotted Tail argued as tribal leaders, and Crow Dog just got mad and shot him. But you know, things were a little, well, not so different, but in a sense different. This is another picture of Spotted Tail, and this is Crow Dog. And where we live now in Parmalee, my family lives in Parmalee, and notice how I said it? Where we live now in Parmalee is the home of the Spotted Tails, and so the knives were put, the way they allocated land was interesting because the knives were Spotted Tails, but they allocated the knives all the way over 40 miles away, and the rest of the Spotted Tails got put in Parmalee. So we weren't even near our family. So to visit our family was an all-day adventure for a long time. The he-dogs are just to the west of the Spotted Tails. So it's like, you know, it's the McLeods or the Hayfields and the McCoys. There we go. Hatfields, yeah, Hayfields. So my grandfather's name, and this is a man that was the code talker, is Ogigampi, and it means they walk around him. He took second in the state of Nebraska in the 100-yard dash. He played semi-professional basketball and baseball in the 30s. He traveled all over the Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri on these teams. He met my grandmother in the late 30s. He worked for the Works. There's 2 elevators once you cross the Missouri. Why am I drawing a blank on the town now? But every time we go by the elevator, it's a concrete elevator, and we point it out. That's Grandpa worked on that. And then there's other sites that he worked on for that, FDR's government program. So it kept him employed. He joined in World War II. He was shot and wounded like a day before the Battle of the Bulge started. So there's a movie out about a tank. Now I drew a blank on the name of that tank, but but they're walking behind the tank. We always wondered how this happened. They said he got strafed, and he got hit in the belly, and he got hit on this side, and the wound came out on this side, and they said he got strafed, but the German Air Force was almost obliterated at that point. So to have an airplane come in and do a strafing run. But when we're watching, is it the Fury? It's the tank crew. And they're walking behind this tank, and all the men are walking behind the tank, and the Germans are shooting, and the bullets are catching the ones that are just sticking out just a little too far, and we think that's what happened to him now. But at the moment that happened, as he collapsed to the ground, it was a conglomeration of a couple platoons, so his cousin was with him. And his cousin and the man that was with him and the man that was with him, and we still don't know their names, they came over and they put all of it back inside him, and then they put the powder on him and did all that, and they prayed, and they prayed in Lakota, and they prayed that if he was to live Tungashila, he would come back and he'd become a man of his word. And so when World War II ended, my grandfather went to seminary and became an Episcopal. And so he was at Parmalee for 10 years as their, and then he went to be he became the police chief in that area too. So, but so that's the man that I remember the most. He died from his wounds, actually, in 1978. All of his internal organs just died. They just stopped. And they assume it was because of the original wounds, and time had run out. So, but he was, my family was bound together pretty tightly, and he was the glue. And the family kind of went a little bit apart, and some things happened in our family, but you know, like all families, people reach a certain age, but we're still together, and we still believe in each other and whatnot. But he was the glue. Felix Knife was his name. My mom, her name is Wigamuki Washtewi, which means rainbow woman, and her name comes from my grandpa Felix. His grandpa before him volunteered for the United States in World War I, and was a part of the first unit that went over to France. And that first unit was called the Rainbow Division. There were whites, there were blacks, there were Hispanics, there were Indians, every race was in that unit, and it went over. The units became segregated after that, but in that unit it was all combined. And because my great-grandfather or her grandfather had done that, the honor name that they gave my mom was related to that. So she is Rainbow Woman. So that was the honor that was afforded her. The man that fought in that battle, Isaac, he was not an American citizen until 10 years after that conflict. So, and that didn't occur until 1928. In the beginning, you saw the powwow picture. We weren't allowed to have a powwow until 1975. And in 1975, they allowed us to practice our religion again. So I've been to a lot of illegal powwows. I grew up going to them. The sculpture in front of the college that is not the horses, but there's one that's made up of all these little circles, is I was 3.5 years old. We were at Flandreau down in the river valley, and that's where I was born. And my mom sat me down right next to the powwow circle, and she said, "You wait here." And she went off and did what she did. And the powwow dancers came out onto the circle, and the drummer started to go, "Hup, hup," like they're getting ready to start. And this guy had on a fancy dancer costume, and he had a blue bustle, like this color. And it was behind him right here. And then he had another blue bustle here. He had 2 on his arms, and he had bells on his legs. And he was over here, and then he saw me, and he came up, and he goes, "Are you ready?" And the drum started, and he danced right in front of me. And so that sculpture is called Powwow Fancy Dancer, and it's an abstract sculpture, but so if I spin my hand real fast, you can see where my finger, it's all that spinning that I saw. And so if you get in your car or you ride your bike and you drive around it, it moves. And you look at it, you can see it spinning and rotating. Yeah. And then in the middle of that sculpture is a heart made out of metal, because dancing and celebrating was a part of our life. It was the heart of who we were. We weren't hunters, we weren't warriors, we were people that loved life. So these are all things that my mom has taught me, and this was a nice picture of her in the 70s. So there, I think I've already given you my name. My sister is next. She is also given, and our names that were given, just so you know, we weren't given our names until 1998. So I was, what was I in 98? 89, I was 23, so I was 32 years old. It was when I first received my Lakota name. You can't have a naming ceremony if you're mourning. So from the time I was 16, when I could be named, until I was 32, we had a death in the family. Now, I can go into you how hard life is out there, and that death is very common. I grew up with a lot of death and saw a lot of things that were pretty brutal, and not just with Indians. How the culture that's out there, the Western culture that's out there, treated them. I saw things that were very difficult. And I saw two white guys shoot each other. So, it's, we were given honor names, and our honor names were given to us because I was actually given an eagle feather by an elder because of me living here, not amongst my people, but amongst you, and being courageous enough to stay here and teach your children. So I was given an eagle feather. And because I was given an eagle feather, I was given the name Hazaknife. And Hazaknife comes from a man that would have been 1860s. He was in one of the fights that occurred before the big battles of the 1868 conflict. So he was the Fetterman fight's a famous fight that occurred over a logging train in Wyoming, and then there's a bunch of other fights that occurred down on the Platte between the Americans and the Lakota. And this guy was in his late 40s, early 50s, and he had had enough of life. He felt he had lived his life, and because he had felt that he had lived his life, he had no other reasons, he had nothing left to accomplish. My mother-in-law had a first husband that told her 3 days before he died, he said, Faye, I could die tomorrow. I've planted a tree, I've got 2 sons, I married a woman that I love, I don't need to live anymore. And then the train hit his vehicle and he died. So it's a tragic story, but the point of that story is that in Lakota that means hokahe. Hokahe means it is a good day to die. And so you reach a point where, I've done what I'm supposed to do. I can live or I could die today. And so this guy named Knife, who wasn't named Knife at that point, said, today's my day to die. So he tied a rope around his ankle, staked himself to the ground in the middle of the battlefield, and held his knife. And he expected to die. And the Americans fought, and he killed a bunch of them, and the battle ended, and he was still alive. And because of his courage, that he stood that way and he fought tied, that he couldn't run, they changed his name to Hazaknife in honor of his courage. So I was given the name for being courageous, for being here. So that's my name. My sister was given the name for similar reasons. Her name is White Shell Woman. It's Punkeshkawi, and it is a family name. So there is a Punkeshkawi that goes all the way back in our family history. And it's a courageous woman, and there's always been a woman, like in Dances with Wolves, Stands with Fist, that has been in our family. So that was the name that was given to my sister. Yeah. And she lives in town. She's my mom and dad's caregivers, so she lives at home, but she works at the college as well. And this is the white shell that they're talking about. They're little conch shells. They're not native to South Dakota. They're more down by Mississippi and Louisiana. But the trade system that occurred, the Lakota would trade things with the group of people that lived in Iowa and Missouri, and then they would trade with the people there, and then the women would decorate their dresses with these white shells. And eventually it leads to those white shells would clink against each other the more they had of them. And then it led to, they discovered that the chew tins, if you rolled them up, they'd make clinking sounds. And then it made jingle dresses. And so Lakota women wear jingle dresses at powwows and they make noise. And now they're bells, ding, 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 ding. But it's all how it just comes about. So how long am I supposed to talk? Oh, geez, I got, 23 of 49. I'm going to ask anybody got any questions because it's going to get crazy.
When you first started, you talked about time don't mean nothing.
Right?
When I hate to go to a doctor here because you sit for an hour. How long would you have to sit to go to a doctor here?
Kind of, but again, you got to remember that, the Rosebud has the only hospital. Murdo doesn't even have a hospital. So everybody either goes to Rapid or to Sioux Falls. So think how long you're waiting. Okay, but then, or Pierre has a doctor down too, has a hospital. So those 3 locations are the locations of the major hospitals. Rosebud has what's called a Indian Health Service hospital, and it has doctors, but they are the doctors that couldn't get into those other places. So it depends. I remember my grandpa, my uncle had gotten injured. He broke his leg, and my grandpa came in to visit him, and I was expected as the child to wait in the car, like we did. Rolled down the windows and left me in the truck, and left the radio on because he was only going to be a little bit. Well, when he came out, the sun was setting, and the radio had died because the car had died. So we had to get jump started to get home. And then my grandpa drove probably 35 miles an hour. So Rosebud to White River is a 38-mile drive. So that 38 miles took 3 hours. And he would pull over to a gas station, he'd buy me a squirt and a candy, and that was to make it home. And I still love squirt to this day. But again, I grew up waiting. Waiting was a part of what we did. And I was taught very early on at all of the funerals that I've been to that it didn't matter how old I was, everybody else got fed first. So they're the people that we're honoring. They're here to honor us by honoring the person that died. So you take care of them first, you don't feed yourself first. And so it was very rude. So I had to wait for food, I had to wait for all sorts of things. So waiting became something that I don't think about, except now, the more I live here, now it becomes an issue. Like we were at the eye doctor with my dad, and it was 3 hours. But, you know, he and I just sat there. And you can't talk to him because it's like this loud when he talks, you know. So, yeah. But, you know, it's just what it is. Waiting it's a common thing, yeah. And you'll see people waiting. And sometimes too, it's like, you know, my cousin Guy, he'll just, you know, it's easier to walk. So if he has to walk to the cousin's house instead of, he'll just walk. And so that's another thing that they do all day. And they'll walk to the next place. And it might take them all day. Yeah, so.
Was there, I don't really mean a conflict, but when growing up with your mother and father being these different backgrounds, getting along?
Oh yeah, church was, like I said, Sundays were, my dad, okay, so my dad, Catherine and Irvin got married. She was a school teacher, he was a welder. They got married. They had 15 years together. That was very tumultuous, and the divorce occurred. My grandmother moved back to Rice Lake, Iowa, and my grandpa got custody of all 4 kids in 1939, South Dakota, because he was the caregiver, not her, which is different, you know, than what we would expect today. So he pawned off, in 1941, he pawned off both the older sons, 11 and 13, to farmers that he knew who needed help because their sons had signed up for the war. So my 2 older uncles, one grew up in Missouri and one grew up in eastern South Dakota working on a farm as a second hand. And the one didn't make any money in Missouri because he charged him for room and board. And so all the money went to paying for room and board. But if you saw that uncle, you could see why. He was 6'3" and he was 240 pounds when he was in the Army. So, but my dad and his twin got pawned off on 6 sisters of my grandpa's. And they finally got fed up and said, you need to take your kids. So he drove to to Iowa and knocked on the door and gave him to my grandma. Then 2 days later, the mayor shows up and says, we can't have an unwed mother with children living in this community. So she moved back to Sioux Falls. And she worked at the Town and Country, which is on 12th Street there, over by Lewis and the Sunshine, and the park with the big USS South Dakota, right in the corner, Sherman Park. And she couldn't afford to keep them. Nobody would do daycare because she was the baker at this Town and Country, so she would go into work at 2 and she'd get done at like 10. And nobody would do daycare for her. And she couldn't afford to not keep this job because it was a night job and it paid really well, and it was during World War II, and it gave her, so if you go south of 12 on Western, about 6 blocks, you come to a big brick building that was the orphanage that she took my dad and his twin to. And they were presentation nuns, so they were all from Ireland. And they were a part, if you go into Avera now, as you walk in and you go to the right in Avera, there's a big wall about the presentation nuns and how they provided health and medical and took care of kids. And the orphans, there were orphanages all over South Dakota. And so my grandmother actually paid a fee to help provide for them, and then she was allowed to visit them. So if she didn't pay the fee, then she wouldn't be allowed to visit them. So she got to visit them on Sundays, and not every Sunday, but she visited them. So my dad and my uncle knew who their mom was, but they didn't know who anybody else was in the family, and they were raised by nuns, very strict, very, he tells the story about having to go out. She said, hey, Mike, would you go get me a length of willow about this long off the willow tree? And he was like, yeah, I'm not in class. So he ran out and he got the willow, and then he got the willow. So he grew up in this orphanage until he was in 8th grade. And in 8th grade, they were, or 7th grade, they got to go downtown, and because Father Flanagan was coming, and Father Flanagan runs Boys Town. And he was giving a presentation, and they were raising money. And so they brought the 2 oldest groups of kids that they had down to see him and hear him speak. And they actually had to go on an elevator. And my dad talks about this because it was, elevator. And they got on the elevator, and as the door was shutting, a hand came in, and it was actually Father Flanagan. And it was 6 boys that all went to Boys Town. So they chose to go to Boys Town because they talked to this priest on the way up, and it was Father Flanagan. And they were so, it was a male figure, and he was so good that they wanted to go there. So my dad then went to Boys Town, which is run by Catholic priests, and it was very structured, very strict, and a home for wayward boys, so they kept everybody on task. And unsupervised time was at night, and it was very rough, but he grew up very, we didn't know how structured he grew up because he never showed us that structure at home. He was always, and now when I go through all of his coaching books and his teaching books, you can see everything is laid out. You could teach from his books because everything you need is in there. And you could teach the way you wanted or coach the way you wanted because that was all there. So it's, his structure was just unbelievable. But the crazy thing is because he grew up without a family, my mom's family took him in like he was their kid. He really liked, and my uncle and he talk about how my mom's family was so caregiving and warm and provided them with a place until they discovered the rest of their family. So there were conflicts, but because they had tasted the Lakota, they would relax on it sometimes. So yes, it was things like church or being to school. Even though I was on the way to the college, he would get dropped off first. Then I would get last. So again, I had to wait. But that's that thought process was. So those were the conflicts that would occur. And my mom would just give. But on church, my mom was, we're going to church, but we're going on my time. So that's, there'd be, yeah. So I grew up with that, I thought it was normal. Then I met my mother-in-law. No. She's a lovely lady. Yeah. Yes?
You talk about Lakota and Dakota. When or how did the name Sioux become so common?
When you guys came. That's what you guys call us. No, but I mean, but that's the term that's used by the Christian-speaking world to describe us. So it became when the Europeans came to Minnesota and South Dakota, that's what they started to call us. Partly because a word was given to them by the Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe, what used to be referred to as Chippewa. They described us as the people that lived in the tall grass. And we moved silently like a snake in the grass, because you can't see a snake going through the grass. But people don't realize that the grass here in western Minnesota was, if a man rode a horse, you could see the man from his waist up. You might see the ears of the horse. So the grass here was that tall. If you go to the Arboretum, you can see that grass, and some of it's 9 feet tall. I mean, it's crazy how tall the grass was here. So the giants of the earth, when they broke the land here, they really had to break a lot of ground. But so that's when the term came. It came from a group of people that were always in conflict with us, and then somebody heard the name described, and then they misinterpreted the name, and then that name became who we were, and that's who they listed us as. And even the term Siouan language is all derived off of that misnomer term. Does that make sense? And I don't mean to make you, I'm not trying to make you feel bad or anything like that, because it's not your fault. I know that. But it's the persistence of still calling us Sioux, which is the issue. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, the truth of the matter is that we weren't called that. Anishinaabe just referred to us as the people that dwell in the prairie and move like snakes in the grass. And the French term for that sounded like Sioux. And so the French term became Sioux.
But there is an upper Sioux and a lower Sioux.
Because that's based off of what? Well, it's off the French term. It's the term that described us. So we are the Rosebud Sioux tribe legally. We haven't changed it on the federal books yet, even though we are Lakota and have always been Lakota. But because till 1975, we weren't really able to. And I'm a part of a generation of people that my mom, my grandparents could speak Lakota 100%. My mom could until she moved in 8th grade. The kids that my mom's generation had until about 15 years ago weren't allowed to speak the language. So we weren't taught the language.
You know, there's been documentaries on TV about the Indians in the whites, but like Canadian, in Canada, and the Canadian Indians down in Mexico and in South Dakota, Minnesota, that years ago, I don't know, probably in the early 1800s, they took the small kids and took them to boarding schools. Did you hear about that?
Oh, yeah.
They made them stay at this, and they'd never see their parents again.
Nope.
And a lot of them would die, or they would kill them, or
Morris,
whatever. Or yeah.
the University of Minnesota Morris is one of the former schools, and they're nervous about digging because they expect to find bodies.
There was 30 of those schools in South Dakota and like 21 in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And did your mom or your grandparents know of any children or families that went to those, that were taken? Oh, okay.
Yeah. I went to college with a guy that grew up still in one of those schools. He was, when he came to Southwest in the 80s, he fought in Vietnam. So he was probably beginning of his 40s then? And he was going to college and using the GI Bill, but he had been taken from his family. I've got a relative named Susie that was moved from Pine Ridge to Seattle. And so I've got family in Seattle, and she grew up in Seattle. The guy I teach math with, his mom got moved from White Earth to Minneapolis on Franklin Avenue. Not that they wanted to be moved, they got moved. Yeah, so there's two things that happened. There was the Indian schools that occurred late 1800s through almost until the 50s. There's documents that they're showing now where these schools were trying to get rid of the kids, so they were selling them.
But they were trying to, they got them there, they brought them to the schools because they wanted to get the Indian out of it
Yep.
and make them all white.
Yep.
And act and learn.
Yeah. So there was a medicine man that was from Sisseton, big boy, and he taught my son some what we call Dakota camps, and he just passed from COVID, but Seaboy, excuse me, not big boy, Seaboy, Danny Seaboy, he was telling us stories one night about his experience, that there was a very beautiful lady that worked at the school, and the kids all, you get the beautiful teacher, and what happens? All the kids, right? And she could speak Dakota, and she would get the kids to speak Dakota, and then they'd get punished. So she was there the only reason she was there was to get the kids to, and then they would break them. So yeah, it's crazy that all that has gone on. Fortunately, because of my grandfather's status, so to speak, and my grandmother died in 1994, and the day she died, the governor of South Dakota declared it a Million Knife Day for that day because she had fostered 320 kids in her life. And I remember this kid living at my grandpa and grandma's house, and he was a cousin. But I found out he wasn't a cousin, I got an uncle right now that never is, not even blood related, but we are related. And he's my uncle. And we celebrate all things, and he's one of those boys. He grew up in our house, and he was one of the foster kids. So my grandma was trying to prevent those kids from going there, so she fostered. So, yeah, there's a real long convoluted story. She would tell me stories about them wearing white hats and suits and standing on the hill burning crosses over the houses, and then yelling and shooting guns at the house. Yeah. Right? I was just taken 2 years ago over by Renville, between Renville and Sacred Heart. There's a rock. It's the hiding rock, and when you run along the river valley, you can't see the rock. You can see trees and part of the rock, and when you're running in the valley, you can't know that the crack in the rock is there, and it can fit a body through the crack. And in the 30s and 40s, the Dakota would run and go up that crack to hide from the farmers that were trying to get bounty, because if you brought in hair, you could get a bounty. So yeah, this stuff is, and that's the hard part is that you're not to blame for it, but there was a culture that was to blame for it. And so they've described part of me has what they call post-traumatic syndrome that's genetically been transferred for almost 6 generations now, because it keeps happening and it keeps happening, so that they transfer that. And my mom was talking to us, and some other people were talking to us, that my son and my daughter might be the first break in our genetics and in our lifestyle, that they've not known any of that. And so they'll be the first in the line of Lakota that have broken free from that trauma.
Do you go back to the Rosebud Reservation?
We're going back in about 5
do you go
days.
a lot?
Once a year now. When my kids were younger, we'd go out at Christmas. We'd go out at Easter. Easter was huge. We always went out at Easter. Christmas, and then I would spend a month to 3 months. Mom would put me And today you'd get in so much trouble. We'd drive over to Brookings, she'd get the jackrabbit line, I'd have a book, she'd give the bus driver money, I'd have a drink, and I'd have a box of cereal, and I would ride the bus to Myrtle, and it would take all day. The bus would arrive at like 9 o'clock at night in Rapid, and I would get to Myrtle at like 7:30, and I would get on the bus at 8 a.m. and go through every little town, and I'd sit right behind the bus driver, and I'd read my book, and I'd draw. I'd always had drawing book too, so I'd draw and I would read, and then when it was time to get off or I had to go to the bathroom, that was the only time I got up, and I did that, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10 summers, and then I would spend the whole summer with my grandparents, and then my mom and dad would come out right before football started, and they'd get me, and bring me home.
Didn't you have a bunch of Indians that were like medicine people?
In our family?
Yeah.
We-
People would go out and visit or
Yeah,
to
yep,
see?
yep. We do have, well, in our community, there's a medicine man that, out in our community that services sort of our community area, and then there's another one and another one. And my family uses the medicine man quite a bit. So we get all sorts of crazy tales that I'm not allowed to tell because it's summertime. Wintertime, you can tell those stories. But there's some really good stories, yeah, it's spooky stories because
Now, my sister went out there, she had cancer, and she went out there and she got some pills from them. She lasted a lot longer than what they said.
oh, cool. Yeah. Well, they're still in touch with all the things that Mother Earth gave us. And a lot of times what's wrong with us is that we've taken Mother Earth away.
Well, half of the pills that you take today were all created from the
In a lo-
plants.
Yeah, yep. Well, almost, I think they say that like 60% of the medicine we have today came from North and South America. Aspirin came from North and South America. I mean, we eat tomatoes, we eat, pumpkin. It all came from North America. So, any other questions?
The Pipestone School, what, they bring children in from East Coast to the Pipestone Indian School?
They did.
They don't anymore.
No.
Is that
Pipestone.
closed?
Yeah,
Oh, it is closed.
yeah. The Flandreau Indian School's still open though.
Oh, Flanders.
Okay, so that's, but they're closely related because they're Santee. They're all related to each other. So
Is that the purpose to keep the Indian culture alive?
it has become that.
Oh.
Yeah. And well, my mom and dad, that's where they met. They both taught there. It was a place where kids could go to school, and it wasn't run like other schools. So it wasn't run where kids were punished and things like that. You do get runaways because they're taken. They make the decision. It's like kids that go to college and then they discover college isn't for them. And when you're 15 years old and you're in Flandreau, South Dakota, it takes some doing. My mom tells stories about they would get on the bus, ride to Wilmer, and then all the teachers would get off, and then from Wilmer they would disperse. And my mom always did Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And she would ride the train out to Coeur d'Alene, and then they'd pick up students there. Then they'd just take the train back, picking up students all along the way, and her job was to chaperone them all the way, and then they'd get to Wilmer, and then the bus would pick them up, and they'd bring them to Flandreau. Yeah, and then they would do that again in the spring. And then the last year, they didn't do that because the service had been from Wilmer to Fargo had been discontinued at that point. So then they just took buses. But those schools, yeah, and Pipestone is kind of an area because of the memorial, the rock that's there is a holy spot for us, and that's believed to be the heart of the earth to the Dakota culture, and that the Pipestone is made from the blood of the earth, and that's an area that's always been held sacred. So there's always been one of the things that Danny Seaboy taught us is that, and I didn't even think of this, I don't know why I didn't think of this, but there's so many things about life that you don't think about, but in a traditional Dakota camp or Lakota camp, there was always a person that was in charge of fire. all year. And their family was the group that were the fire keepers. And so, you know, you had to keep that fire. And so in every group that traveled together, there was a family that kept the fire. And no matter what, that fire kept burning, so then everybody had fire. Even while you were traveling, that fire kept burning. So you didn't lose fire because you didn't have flint and stone, so to speak, and you didn't have, sometimes fire came from naturally occurring, so you had to keep your fire. So the people that lived in the Pipestone area were the people that kept the stone. And then there was a school that was there because there were Indians there. Now, I still refer to myself, I grew up calling myself an Indian, and I grew up with people calling us Indians, and my family calling us Indians. So I use that term only because that's my familiar term. I'm an American Indian, I'm a Native American, and those are terms that are being used now. But I'm Sichangu Lakota. Any other questions? Did it make sense what I was saying about how the name came? Sure. And I didn't mean to upset you. I hope I didn't. No. Because it's when it happened. Come back soon. Yeah, I got what? 20 more slides. What's that? Yeah, I could tell winter stories then. Yeah. Because technically I did break into some stories, but we're not allowed, because summer's when it's the tale of the grasshopper and the ant works summer's the time that you get everything ready so you can survive the winter. And that was, you didn't sit in, there was only 6 hours of sun, so you slept. Where in the wintertime you were in your teepee and you had nowhere to go because it was cold out. So you told stories, yeah. And storytelling is what we do. I grew up with people telling stories like this, and a lot of them were like fables because they were meant to show how you were supposed to behave and what you weren't supposed to do, and that was bad acting like that, and so, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, Pilamae for having me. Thank you.